As I said in my welcoming, I'm really pleased to be here today, even honored. I don't get here very often, in part because I'm traveling around this year. That's what I've just decided to do. In fact, tomorrow morning, very early, I'm leaving for a month, going to Scotland to visit a friend for 2 weeks, and then dropping down into the Mediterranean to visit some of the bigger islands in the Mediterranean. So I've spent the week getting ready. I went to the outlet store, bought a pair of jeans, new polo shirt, packed it in a suitcase along with enough underwear for a week. I'm going to do washing while I'm gone. In case you're curious, yes. Got out my passport, which the dog chewed. But it does work. I've discovered that before. And checked out my airline tickets, put those away. Also put away some of my tour books. I'm still old-fashioned and take hard copies of stuff along because I want to read up on what I'm doing. Medicines were packed, I think. Swimming suits in the bag. I called the credit card company to tell them that I was going to be out of the country, and they gave me an emergency ID number if I should lose my credit card. Got my money pouch. It's going to be suspended around my waist. And if Vicki were along, we'd have an additional suitcase that would have an iPad and an iPhone and women's clothing in it, not men's. And we'd be off. And then I come to church today, and Jesus tells his disciples what to take on their journey. A walking stick. No food or money. Ooh. Pair of sandals. No extra clothing. And an attitude. And I think, is he kidding? You know, I don't think he's kidding, though. I think Jesus has some ideas about what it takes to make the journey of faith significant and important to us. Granted, he says some quaint things like, take along a walking stick. Well, when I'm in Europe, I like to do a lot of walking. And I tell myself, you know, when I come home, I'm going to do more walking than I usually do. It's really good for my body. It's really good for the environment. So the first thing I do when I get home is get in my car and drive 2 blocks to Starbucks. I maybe should remember that I should do more walking. Perhaps that's what the walking stick metaphor is about. But actually with Jesus, when he says some simple things, there's often some really serious background that goes into his message. In this particular case, Exodus 12, chapter 11, reminds the Israelites to take along a walking stick to remind them of the speed at which they left Egypt as Pharaoh was chasing them. The speed of a walk, and God delivered them. So they're to remember that time of deliverance with their walking stick. It's as if Jesus were saying, when you go on a journey, remember the community that is supportive and is there behind you as you go. Well, I can remember as a child, no, I wasn't a child, I was a youth. When I would leave home to go on a date, my dad would say, remember whose you are. Later shortened to, remember whose. That was his parting word for me. I was not to forget who I am and the special group to which I belong. So I think that's Jesus' message with the walking stick metaphor. It's don't forget who you are. Each one of us here is special, and we belong to each other. Well, the second thing that Jesus advises us to do is to take no money or food. I think simply Jesus was reminding us that security and success are really not part of our spiritual journey. There's something else, perhaps the kingdom of God. I leave that to prioritize in your life what you think is more special about the Christian faith than security and money. Number 3, take along some sandals, but no change of clothing. In other words, trust God and each other. I confess to you that's a difficult thing for me to do. It's just not part of the American DNA to trust each other. But I also confess to you that when you're part of a special community, there's something special that goes on between people. When my wife died 7 months ago tomorrow, I didn't have to buy food for a month. In part because of the generosity of many of you sitting in this pew, and the generosity of other Christians in the area. The Christian community is about giving and receiving. We need to remember, however, that if we're going to give, we also have to have the attitude of being receptive and willing to receive the gifts that other people have to offer us. And that's a very difficult thing for many people, myself included. So Jesus is telling us to trust in each other and in God, to remember that we're part of a community, and not to be centered around security and monetary things. That's the attitude we're to take. Sound like anybody you know? Well, not me. The only place I comply is with the sandals. I pack sandals in my suitcase. The rest of it is really a challenge for me. And yet I realize when Jesus is mentioning it, that he's lifting up to us some goals that we as a Christian community need to be about. I don't want to today put down some of the values in American society, but I do want to lift up that which has centered the Christian community and the Hebrew community for thousands of years. Remember whose you are. Trust in God and in each other. Don't make money and security your goal. And you know what? All of us can do that. Martin Luther King Jr. said, you don't need to be a PhD to be a Christian. Jesus presents us with stuff that we can all do. And as we look at the Bible stories, we find that it's ordinary people that have done those things, that have done extraordinary things in history. Talk about ordinary people, for example. There was Noah. There he was, a silly old man building an ark in a driveway. And when he celebrated, he did it by getting drunk. That's pretty ordinary. And there was Moses, who was a murderer who couldn't speak. He stuttered. So every time he spoke, he had to have someone interpret for the people what he had to say. But he trusted in God, and with that trust, he was called to go speak and even yell out to the mightiest person in the world, Pharaoh, the King of Kings, the power of all powers. And then there was King David. Eventually, he got to be popular and a powerful person amongst his people, but he started out just very ordinary, a runt of a kid. You remember the story with 5 smooth stones coming up against a giant of a man who had the latest in battle armor? There's Peter in the New Testament. Good old Peter. Hot and cold. One day saying, let's go on this mountaintop, and the next day saying, let's go to Jerusalem. Some days depressed, other days elated. I sure wouldn't want to be the doctor that would try to make a diagnosis of his mind. In fact, he used to change his mind all the time. He was so ordinary. And yet Jesus said, upon Peter's faith, I will build my church. And Jesus himself used very ordinary people as the centerpiece of the stories he told. A farmer sowing seed. Shepherds watching their sheep. Fishermen casting their nets. A man building his home. A woman who'd been abused. A child who he said was going to be the centerpiece of heaven. A merchant selling pearls. A man in a watchtower. All people who were ordinary, but did extraordinary things because they knew who they were, they knew who to trust, and they knew what their goals were to become. And then, of course, there's Jesus himself, crucified like a common criminal. And yet, one of my preacher friends said this last Easter, that is a reminder to us that the least that can happen to us is resurrection. Or as St. Paul said in his letter to Philippians, while he was in prison, I can't decide if I want to live or if I want to die. Because whichever it is, I'm with Jesus. In other words, we can't lose. And maybe that's the bottom line on what the story was all about today that we read. And when people really believe that, as I said, extraordinary things happen. Bill Johnson, who was a former pastor here even before I came, used to say that the Christian community had three things that designated itself. They were entirely fearless, always joyful, and forever in trouble. Anyway, if that sounds good to you, let's shake the dust off our feet and get on with this spiritual journey. And by the way, I'm still going to take my suitcase tomorrow.